Hello, I'm Roger Koopman. I'm privileged to serve and represent District 3 on the Public Service Commission in Southwest Montana. And today is Constitution Day, and I'm very privileged to be able to just offer some of my own thoughts about the Constitution today and hopefully stir the thoughts of others to look into the Constitution, its background, its history, the people that framed and ratified the Constitution, far more than I can do today. You can't do the subject of the Constitution much justice in a matter of a 10 or 15-minute talk, but I just want to at least share a few thoughts that I have that maybe, again, will help others to take an interest in looking into the topic a whole lot more. When I was a state legislator some years ago, I would go into the public schools on Constitution Day, or actually throughout the Constitution Week, and I would share with them over the course of a class period things about the Constitution and the people that framed it that in many cases both the teachers and the students were not aware of. And I could really see the light go on in these young people's eyes. And they got it. They understood that the Constitution isn't just some dusty old document that occasionally some politician mentions, but that the Constitution is an incredibly precious document that really no time in the world, in the history of the world, was anything before it created. And so let's talk a little bit about it, and maybe just begin with a little bit of a history of Constitution Day and how the Constitution was in fact created. It was May 29th of 1787 that the Constitutional Convention first met in Philadelphia, and there were 55 men who were delegates of that Constitutional Convention, and even at that time there were those that were worried that the Constitutional Convention would produce something very different ultimately than what the nation wanted. It was eventually on September 17 of 1787. It was passed out of the Constitutional Convention after a tremendous amount of, you can imagine, wrangling and debating and so forth over many, many important issues that divided them. And then went to the states for ratification, and there were a total of 1,648 delegates to the 13 state conventions that eventually ratified the Constitution in, it would have been in actually May 29 of 1790. Interesting, May 29, it happens to be the birthday of my favorite patriot, Patrick Henry of Virginia. But I think that was entirely coincidental. In fact, interesting to note that Patrick Henry himself, who was considered probably even more popular in his state of Virginia than George Washington, of all people, would not attend the Constitutional Convention. And you have to remember, the American people had just gone through an incredible war, and somehow were able to come out with a victory to gain their independence over a very powerful England, and they were. It was a war that was won over the tyranny of the British government, of a government that was too centralized, too powerful, and did not protect or respect their natural rights or their rights as Englishmen. And so for them to come together now and create a permanent central government among the 13 colonies was something that worried a lot of them, that they would end up creating something that was once again too powerful. And in fact, it was Patrick Henry who said, "I smelt a rat." And he himself, a great patriot, but would not attend the Constitutional Convention. Originally, the convention was supposed to just be a process of amending the existing if you will, Constitution, the Articles of Confederation that certainly needed improvement and refinement and so forth. But then it ultimately became a convention to create an all-new document, and I think that's what a lot of folks like Patrick Henry and many others were concerned about. But you know, it is often called in fact, there's a book by this name, The Miracle of Philadelphia. And there isn't any other way that you can really look at what happened over those 4 months than to see it as a miracle of many different men representing diverse colonies across the 13 colonies, 13 states, coming together and somehow being able to compromise in such a way, and with great wisdom and great foresight, to come up with the Constitution. And you know, I don't have time really to talk about all the aspects of the Constitution and why it was a miracle, but the concept of enumerated powers was something that was built into the Constitution. In other words, the framers saw that the Constitution should specify what the different areas and branches of government had the power to do and what they did not have the power to do. In other words, it was a limiting document. It very specifically stated what the people were going to allow the various branches of government to do, and no more. I sometimes like to liken the Constitution to a license. We're used to government licensing various professions and so forth, and in order to get a license to be, let's say, a physician or whatever it might be, a plumber or whatever, there are certain terms, certain things you have to go through, and certain ways you have to qualify, and terms of how you are going to operate. Well, the Constitution was the people licensing the government, and really that's far more important than the government licensing the people in different ways. The people licensing the government. Here is what we want you to do. Here is how you can do it, and these are things you can't do. And so the enumerated powers that were built into the Constitution specifically laid out what government could and couldn't do. Another just miraculously wise process or wise decision that the framers made was to create 3 branches of government of equal power and of different areas of responsibility. Article 1 creates the legislative branch, Congress and Senate. Article 2 creates the executive branch, the president, which nowadays includes a tremendous number of executive agencies and so forth. And then Article 3 creates the judiciary, including the federal court system and the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court. That concept of checks and balances, where no branch of government is more powerful than the other, and we can argue as to whether that balance has been well maintained or not, but that very concept of checks and balances with 3 specific branches of government was something very, very, very unique that the framers came up with, that we have been greatly blessed as a result of in this country, that they came up with it. Another interesting area that was a challenge was, what do we do with the big states and the small states in terms of representation in federal government, particularly in the legislative branch? And the big states said, well, it just ought to be by population, and the small states said, wait a minute, we have our rights too as small rural states, and we're going to be totally overwhelmed by the larger states, which back then was Virginia and New York. And so they came up with a compromise that was, I think it was called the Virginia Plan, whereby one chamber of the legislature, the House of Representatives, would be elected by population. On the basis of population would be the states would have so many representatives allotted to that state by congressional district, and then the Senate was set up to have 2 senators per state. Whether you're a small state or you're a big state, you get equal representation. And that remains that way to this day. Interestingly, back then, the senators were not elected by direct vote of the people, but actually by the vote of the state legislators and legislatures. And in those days, the framers believed that it was so important to preserve the independence of the individual states that they opted for a vote of the state legislators to elect the senators rather than direct vote. That, of course, was changed with the 17th Amendment. But anyway, that's a little bit of history. Incidentally, we often hear the term founders, and that's used a lot with regard to our country and the Constitution. The founders is a broad term that refers to the framers, who were the 55 people that met in Philadelphia, the 1,648 ratifier delegates from the 13 states, and then others that would call themselves either Federalists or so-called Anti-Federalists that were also very much involved in the process at that time. Together, those are all founders. And so it's a kind of a useful thing to remember when the term founder is used. Of course, one other thing that I should mention is the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights came about because a number of delegates to the state conventions and individual states were still very concerned about the amount of centralized power that might be vested in this new government. And again, remember that they very jealously guarded the independence of their states, and they saw the United States of America as being, in fact, 13 states that came together to create the federal government, but that they were essentially sovereign and independent in many ways of the central government. They didn't want the central government to become overly powerful and dominant. And so a number of states, including New York and Virginia, would not ratify the Constitution until the promise was made that there would be a Bill of Rights. And of course, we're familiar with the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and each one of those, again, is a very specific statement of the people's rights where the government cannot tread. A well-known revolutionary flag stated with a snake on it, "Don't tread on me." And what they were referring to is the British government. And they didn't want their own government that they were creating to tread on them either. And so the Bill of Rights was 10 specific ways that government could not operate and could not tread on the rights of the people. And we can get into that a little bit in a few minutes, but again, we really don't have the time to do justice to the subject. But if it wasn't for some of those states, ultimately it was 6 states holding out to one degree or another, we wouldn't have a Bill of Rights. They were sufficiently concerned that there needed to be more safeguards built into that Constitution that then in 1789, Madison then introduced the Bill of Rights that then was passed out of that same year out of Congress, and then part of ultimately the ratification process. You know, I think it's important to recognize that again that the very last thing that the American people wanted in those days was to replace one tyrannical government with another, to throw off British tyranny and the royalty system of government of Britain, and then put themselves right back into the yoke of tyranny again of their own making. So they were very opposed, for example, to having a king or any kind of a royal type of government. And again, each colony was very protective of their individual independence, you might say. The founders were great students of history that wanted to avoid the mistakes of past civilizations, and they studied those civilizations and that history, where the people's rights in these countries, in these places where oftentimes things looked very bright, but then over time their rights were never secure. Countries that went from revolution to revolution, from trading one dictatorship for another. So Americans, they saw themselves as kind of having a special place in the history of the world. They saw themselves as a kind of a special God-ordained place in history, with the opportunity to create through the rule of law the greatest degree of human freedom, opportunity, and prosperity that the world had ever known. And not through, all-powerful government that could do various things for people, even if they appeared to be good intentions, but as Thomas Jefferson put it, by putting the government in chains and freeing the people. Chaining government to the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. And again, a good way of understanding what was motivating the framers of the Constitution is to look back on the previous famous document written mostly by Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence. And a very well-known, and of course that declaration began with when in the course of human events, and it goes on to state that they needed to declare to the world why they were becoming an independent state from Great Britain, and what their core values and beliefs were that caused them to leave the British control, and I think you'll find this very familiar, where it says this part of the Declaration that says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments were instituted among men." In other words, they saw as the primary role of government to secure rights already given to them by a creator, or another way of putting it, natural rights, as John Locke created probably the best explanation of what natural rights mean. But it said to secure these rights, governments were instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Well, consent of the governed is the democratic process. Just rights is defined by the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. And I'm going to get back to this in a minute. I don't want to go too far on that right at the moment. But and so one of the things that the founders believed was that really the most important form of government was self-government. And that term self-government is something that I think is probably not fully understood these days as what it meant to them back at that time. Self-government meant governing yourself, which meant personal responsibility, personal virtue, personal restraint, and an abiding faith and respect for the rights of others. All of this was grounded not in some cynical or changeable politics, but in the belief that the ultimate lawgiver was God, and the ultimate judge of all things was Almighty God. One of the things I'd like to share. A professor by the name of Rob Nadelson, who was a professor of constitutional law at the University of Montana Law School for a number of years, and he wrote a very authoritative book, The Original Constitution, and he talks about what it was among these unusual and wide-ranging group of people that allowed the Constitution to be developed and among these people, and to create the kind of free government and free land that we had. And he talked about them having a common history. But then, just reading from his book here for a minute, so he says the Constitution was written and ratified by people who shared certain core principles and values. Nearly all of the founders believed that God had established a natural law for mankind. This natural law theory was of the sort outlined by John Locke and other radical Whig philosophers. The theory incorporated in the Declaration of Independence that we just read. From this belief, the founders deduced principles and values that should control government and principles and values the government should promote. So what are some of these principles and values? Well, again, they believed in the concept of natural rights. They believed in a republican form of government, that is to say, a republic, and they believed in decentralized government. And again, they believed that the ultimate purpose of government, first and foremost, was to secure our rights. That was what was in their mind when they met in Philadelphia in 1787. And the concept of inalienable rights, written in, again, to the Declaration, basically said rights that cannot be transferred, cannot be given away. They're yours. They're yours at birth. And you cannot authorize government to justly take away the rights of your neighbor or your rights. And that's what an inalienable or unalienable, however you wish to say it, right is. I had some fun with the young people when I was speaking at the different classes in the public schools. And one of the lessons I talked to them about was what form of government was created in the Constitution. And I'd ask them to raise their hands how many believe that the founders created a democracy. And of course, all the hands went up, and you would expect that would be the case. And yet, as the story goes, after the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were leaving the hall and were out on the street, a lady went up to Benjamin Franklin and said, Mr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And he looked at the lady and said, "A republic, if you can keep it." Well, are we a republic or are we a democracy? Well, that's an interesting question, and I the way I illustrated this to these young people in the classrooms, I would say, okay, tell you what, we are now a pure democracy, and so I see that there are more girls in this class than there are boys. They have the majority by 2 or 3 people. So in that democracy now, you girls can stand up and make a motion that the boys give away everything that they have in their pockets to you girls. You consider that to be the proper and socially responsible thing to do. And so we have a vote. And all the boys vote no, and all the girls vote yes, and the girls win. And so now the boys have to give everything they have to the boys. Well, is that a just power of government, going back to the Declaration of Independence? No, of course not. But that is what is possible in what would be called a pure democracy. What the founders created was something very different. They created a constitutional republic. And they did not create a situation where any politician, by virtue of being elected, could claim that they have the mandate to do anything that they want to do or what is popular that day, even among a majority of people. But they could only exercise just powers under the Constitution. In other words, maybe a good way of putting it is that our elected officials, our legislators, our congressmen, senators, and so forth, our elected government officials are selected democratically and are controlled constitutionally. You don't have the right in a republic to simply vote away your own rights or the rights of others. Now, the Constitution can be amended. It's a very difficult process, intentionally so. But you don't have the right to ignore the Constitution for any particular reason, social cause, or anything else. And so that's what a republic is. It is rule of law, not of men. That's a term that probably you've heard in the past, and I think that little description of the girls and the boys in the sixth grade class is just a simple way of describing that. We have in America a rule of law, and not a rule of men in the sense of direct democracy, but that the power of government is controlled, and of individual legislators, individual government officials, is controlled and limited by the Constitution. And, sometimes people kind of wince at that. They think, what were they thinking back then? I mean, we trust these people, and they're out for our best interests, and that's why we elect them, and so forth. A little quote by Daniel Webster, great U.S. Senator back in the early days of our country, I think kind of says it pretty well. He said, "The Constitution was made to guard the people against the dangers of good intentions." And when you think about that, most people in public life have very good intentions. But in the process of those good intentions, if they are eroding our liberties in one way or another, then those are freedoms and liberties that we may never get back. And so that's why the Constitution was created a republican form of government. Another book I'm looking at here called Restoring the Lost Constitution by Professor Randy Barnett, he put it this way with regard to what makes American government under the Constitution so unique. He says, here it is. He says, America is not a government, is not an island of liberties in a sea of government, which is exactly the history of mankind over many centuries. Liberties here and there that can be taken away, can maybe come back, but it's an island of liberties in a sea of overwhelming government. But he said the Constitution was actually enacted and formally amended, creates islands of government powers in a sea of liberty. And that's a neat way to look at America, an island of government in a sea of liberty. Liberty is the priority. Liberty is what America is all about. And again, the Constitution focuses more than anything on that. Now, finally, I guess to kind of wrap things up here, and I apologize that we're rambling a little bit back and forth, but again, it's such a huge issue or a huge topic that I can just barely touch on some of these things and hopefully get folks interested to do their own investigating, their own thinking, their own discussing, and to begin to recognize just how incredibly blessed our nation is, and how important the Constitution is, and understanding and defending that Constitution. Some people declare that the Constitution is a so-called living document whose meaning is ever-changing with the times. But frankly, this contradicts the very concept of constitutional government and ultimately produces rule of men, not of law. some argue, including actually a former president, I won't mention, but a former president, that it is virtually impossible. I think the term he used was unrealistic for anyone, for judges or for just people in general, to be able to determine the original intent of the founders, what their words actually meant in the Constitution. So we need to interpret it by what the needs of society are today. Well, I sure don't agree with that. If that were true, then frankly, we are in big trouble. Essentially left with no Constitution at all. Just sort of the shifting sands and opinions of lawyers and judges and politicians and the media. No, we must always understand and honor the original intent. We may want to change the Constitution by a prescribed amendment process, but we do not have the authority to ever ignore the original meaning of the Constitution. And frankly, to understand original intent and original meaning of the Constitution, we do need to understand the historical context in which the founders found themselves. And we need to understand the meanings of words, terms that they used at that time. The Federalist Papers are an excellent source and legal books at that time and what legal principles meant. And even dictionaries at that time, because words have important meaning, and in some cases words have different meaning then than they do now. Even subtly, they can be important. Consider, for example, I'll just give you a couple of three examples. Consider the Second Amendment to the Constitution that reads, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Well, some people nowadays seize on the term militia and they say, well, they're talking about the Army. They're talking about the National Guard. They're talking about the military. Militia in those days to the founders was every citizen. Let every citizen be armed. They said, and it was the armed citizenry was the militia, and that's. But again, if you don't understand that, and also the context of the times, that they never would have thought for a minute of the people not having the right to own firearms, both for their own personal defense and defense against the potential of tyranny abroad or at home. But again, you need to understand words. The word commerce in the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Commerce meant something different back then than it often does today. And again, it might seem subtle, but it's important because the Commerce Clause is often used to expand the scope of the federal government. Some people say unconstitutionally, beyond the limits of the Constitution. But understanding the use of the word commerce can be helpful to us in understanding what they meant in terms of interstate commerce and federal regulation of same. The First Amendment, of course, when we're familiar with that, the Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of speech and so forth. Well, a lot of folks say, well, that means, wall of separation. And what does wall of separation mean? Well, wall of separation is not a term that's in the Constitution or the Declaration, but it was Jefferson writing a letter to a Baptist church, I believe, basically saying that, in other words, that the government was not to in any way tread on the rights, the religious rights of the people. And an easy way that could happen is by establishing a state church, a favored denomination or sect or religion or whatever. And so and the people that founded that framed the Constitution were not by any means anti-religion, but they were very much against the state, the government, establishing religion. They wanted to create an environment of freedom where people were free to pursue their own religious faith, they believed that was very important, and for the state to interfere with that would in time erode if you will, the faith of the nation. And so again, understanding the times, understanding the context, and the values of the people that wrote the Constitution helps you to understand what the terms in the words in the First Amendment mean. Again, if we want to change it, there's an amendment process to change it. But to say, well, we can't really understand what the founders meant, what their intention was, is not true. Sometimes it takes some effort and some research, but it's extremely important for us to understand the true intent and meaning of the Constitution and what those who wrote it and ratified it fully intended. So I guess at this point I'd kind of like to wrap things up. I just want to say again that on this Constitution Day, recognize that we have something incredibly valuable and precious in the United States Constitution. Nothing like it was ever established before, and nations even now try to imitate it, but often not successfully. We are free because we have rule of law, and because we have a sovereign law under a sovereign people that and they believed that was indeed under the lawgiver, a sovereign God, that says, government, you can do this, here's the way you have to do it, and here you can't do that at all. That's reserved to the states or to the people, but specifically prohibits various ways that the government could encroach on our freedoms if we did not have a written and Constitution that's interpreted in the way it was intended when it was written. So, I really encourage you to dig into things more. Understand that my thoughts that I share today are simply mine. I'm not representing the Public Service Commission here, and these views are purely my own. But understand again just how precious our Constitution is, and I encourage you to understand the Constitution and then to stand up and defend it. Thanks for listening.